Let's start with the first graph. We have y equals 5 times 1/2 to the x plus 3. The first thing to notice is that this 3 is going to be the horizontal asymptote. And the idea is that as x goes to infinity, 1/2 to the x is going to go to 0. So you have 5 times 0 plus 3, and that's going to be 3. Another thing is this 1/2 is less than 1, so this is going to look like this. It's going to decrease. At x equals 0, I get 8. And then if I plug in a couple values, so let's say x equals 1, I get 5.5. And if I plug in x equals 2, I get 4.25. So as x approaches positive infinity, it's going to go closer and closer to the horizontal asymptote of 3. And then as x approaches negative infinity, it's going to be 5 to the 1/2. Well, 1/2 to the x, rather, is going to go to positive infinity. So that's just going to keep going up like this. Okay, let's look at another example. We have y equals 2 raised to the negative square or absolute value of x. I can rewrite this as 1 over 2 raised to the absolute value of x. And this one, notice that if I plug in, whether I plug in 1 or -1, I'm going to get the same value, or 2 and -2. So I can make a table. I'm going to put 0 here. So if I plug in 0, I get 1. If I plug in 1, I get 1/2. If I plug in -1, I also get 1/2. And if I plug in 2, I get 1/4. If I plug in -2, I also get 1/4. So when I go to graph this, at 0 it's 1. And then it's going to decrease in both directions. So at 1 it's 1/2. -1 it's also 1/2. 2 it's 1/4. And -2 is also 1/4. And notice that as x approaches positive or negative infinity, 1 over 2 to the absolute value of x is going to approach 0 because it's going to be 1 over a really big number. So that's going to 0. So it looks something like that. Okay, last one. We're looking at a bell-shaped curve. So it's 2 raised to the negative times the quantity x plus 1 squared. So this one I'm going to get rid of the negative by putting everything on the bottom. So this plus 1 means it's centered at x equals -1. So the symmetry, so it's going to be symmetric about x equals -1. Okay, so when I make the table, I want to keep in mind that -1 is kind of the middle. So if I plug in -1, I end up getting 1. Let's see, let's go to 0 next. Plug in 0, I get 1/2. And if I plug in -2, I also get 1/2. So if I go one more, let's say if I plug in 1 and -3, I get 1/16. So clearly, as x is getting bigger, it's going to go to 0. And as x goes to -infinity, it's also going to 0. So the values are decreasing in both directions, so getting closer and closer to 0.